All right. Thank you for joining us this evening for a special episode, kind of talking about something I dealt with earlier on in the podcast I did on my show, Facts, dealing with the person of Matthew or Levi, the gospel writer that has been alleged in his name. And so, one of the things that I always want to do on Facts and what we want to do at Explore is to allow ourselves to be pushed back and also hear all perspectives. I mean, many a time, those that tune into my program are going to hear my perspective. Naturally, so I'm the host of the show. But sometimes we have such a condensed opportunity because most of my programs are around 45 minutes and we can only cover so much. But one of the things that happen, and I think it's a good thing, and it's one of the better things that happens, is when we make arguments out loud and then we pose ideas, it creates bigger discussion. It creates pushback and deeper discussion, deeper scholarship, deeper research, deeper study. And I think that is a wonderful thing. And so some of the pushback I got was to now take this and to look at a broader subject than just what was posed in a 45-minute program that's just hitting bullet points and moving on, particularly just focusing on that program about the person, Matthew, his life, his death, what we have in history about his martyrdom, his influence on the Gospel of Matthew and in the churches. So I'm going to go ahead and bring on Chrissy over here, and we have a couple things to go over as we relate with our different perspectives. We obviously disagree. There's no doubt about that. And there's different perspectives in here. So kind of tell us a little bit about your perspective, and then I'll kind of give a rundown reminder of mine, and then we'll actually engage back and forth on some of the discussion. So go ahead and share your perspective about the whole Levi, Matthew, or maybe James, depending on the manuscript. And what's the problem? What is it we're fighting against here in scholarship? What are we looking at in the data that causes the problem?
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Chrissy Hansen. I'm a nerd. So when it comes to the issue of are Levi and Matthew the same person? I'm not going to necessarily argue that there is no way that they are not the same person, but that the data is actually early on is actually fairly ambiguous, and it's ambiguous in no small part because not even early Christians could even agree on the subject. So when we go and actually look at the early information, the first indication that we have that they are ever the same person really is when the Gospel of Matthew pops up. So at least in the usual model of Markan priority that the vast majority of academics accept. The Gospel of Matthew is written after the Gospel of Mark and is taking parts of Mark and putting and reusing them. In fact, there's a huge percentage of Mark that appears in the Gospel of Matthew and also in Luke. So they're the synoptic Gospels because they syncopate on various different parts of their work. In fact, you can just put them side by side and they'll look almost, in places they will be word for word identical because they're copying each other. So this is where things get really interesting, is when the Gospel of Matthew comes up. In the Gospel of Mark, there is the story of the publican Levi, who is converted by Jesus, and he ends up following Jesus as one of his followers. And then in the list of the apostles, later, Levi is not actually mentioned in the Gospel of Mark in that list of the apostles. It's Matthew, who is also called a publican. When the Gospel of Matthew comes up, Matthew sublimates these. Instead of the story where Levi is converted, is instead the person is named Matthew, and it's just identified with the same apostle. This is now his origin story in the movement. What gets confusing is that while this seems clear cut to us later, it's like, okay, well, these were just two names for the same person. This is not actually how Christians always interpreted this. And even the same authors actually had their own different interpretations, which we're going to get into. But just as like a brief rundown, like Tatian's Diatessaron, which is it's a gospel harmony. It's meant to basically harmonize all of the texts together. Actually treats them as different figures. It actually preserves Mark's account of Levi being converted and then also preserves Matthew's account of Matthew being converted side by side, basically. So it's actually preserving both as separate people. And then you get Heracleon, who is a Valentinian Gnostic Christian, and he actually lists Matthew and Levi in the same list as separate figures as well. The Book of the Bee records that Levi was killed in a different place than Matthew was. Levi is killed by Carmus and Paneas, and Matthew is killed. It dies in Antioch, actually. Origen has two different ideas of this. In Contra Celsum, he thinks that he says that Levi is a different figure because he's responding to Celsus, who's accusing Christians of, and Jesus in particular, of having just associated with all these low lives of society. And he's like, he was associating with publicans, tax collectors, and all these different people. And then Origen's like, well, actually, Levi wasn't one of the apostles, unless you take this one manuscript of Mark, which associates them. And we'll get into that because the manuscript tradition is really interesting. Mm-hmm. Pseudo Clement lists Levi and Matthew separately. The Acts of Thaddeus says that Levi was Thaddeus, actually. That one is a very common one in early tradition. Some manuscripts of Mark 3:18 read James instead of Levi. Ephraim of Cyrus says that Matthew was evangelizing in India and Judea while Levi was evangelizing in Pontus. So he, again, treats them as different figures who evangelized in different places. And Pseudo Hippolytus conflates Jude / Thaddeus with Levi and differentiates him from Matthew. And it goes on. The manuscript tradition frequently associates Thaddeus and Levi more than almost any other figure, actually.
Yeah, I think those are good points, and I look forward to getting into those discussions as well. And it does create kind of an interesting dynamic because some of the major apostles that we talk about, we don't have this kind of controversy. Say Simon, whose name was also Peter, or Cephas, his Aramaic, his Greek, and his Hebrew name. And some of the more predominant apostles that did have more than one name, and that is because of the commonality of names. James being the 11th most popular in Palestine, we would expect to see descriptions next to it: James the Less, or James, the brother of John, or the son of Zebedee, etc., in order to distinguish some of them amongst themselves. But these are more prominent figures. When we get to some of these others, there's still, even outside of Matthew and Levi, there's other people that are debated, like Thaddeus, you mentioned a minute ago. Is Thaddeus Judas not Iscariot in John's gospel? Well, it seems like it is. And if that's the case, why did John choose to go with Judas, not Iscariot, instead of just calling him Thaddeus, which appears in the other synoptic accounts that John does not have in his account? So there's a difficulty, I think, even for the early church fathers and patristics to distinguish sometimes in these narratives people of similar names, or people that have been changed to a different name. And so it's like, okay, so is that story about Matthew all along, or is that story about James, or is that story about whoever? And so you get some of this distinguishing differences here. One of the things that's unique in the discussion here is that when you look at, say, Jerome or even Origen himself, this is one of the crazy things about Origen in his commentary on Matthew. He seems to change his mind on this matter, and I think we'll get into a little bit more why. But in his commentary on Matthew, which is one of his earlier commentaries, he stated that Matthew, who is also known as the tax collector or the publican there, and so he once saw Matthew in the commentary as the tax collector, which the only story in Matthew's commentary, and the sad thing is we don't have the full end of all the commentaries of Origen, a lot of which was preserved either in fragment form or Eusebius's quotations. I really wish we could get into, I wish we had in antiquity the full surviving text of Matthew and the commentary there from Origen, especially when he gets to these exact passages. because in his intro, we know that he stated that Matthew was once a tax collector. So
Right.
where's he getting that from? Is that from the same narrative that we find in Matthew's gospel? So he kind of goes into that. You look at others, Jerome and the illustrious men, when he gets to the point talking about Matthew, he says, Matthew, who is also Levi, who from a publican became an apostle. John Chrysostom, who wrote a commentary on Matthew, talked about how they actually concealed the name of Matthew in the other gospels because of his former life. And then some get into the idea that there was actually this point in Matthew's life or in Levi's life where he's referring to himself only as a tax collector. And then when talking about him as an apostle, they call him Matthew. There's other writings of this. I was looking at some of them. And another one for your case as well, by the way, is that Clement of Alexandria in Stramata. And maybe you mentioned this and I just missed it.
Yeah. He's the one that records the account of Heracleon.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And so there was disruption there with Clement, but again, when we get into that region, I think there's something interesting happening. But Chrysostom said that when others had concealed him under this name, so the other writers being Luke and Mark, but he himself did not conceal himself under this name. They marvel at how the evangelist displays his own former way of life while the other evangelist disguise his name, calling him Levi. We see another part of that with Jerome trying to explain the same thing into his former life. There's also something called the Golden Legend. It's one of the legends. Kind of you went into some of the legends as well, like the Book of B, which is a medieval writing. And in the Golden Legend, it actually has the opposite of that. It actually says Matthew had two names, Matthew and Levi. Mattheus is interpreted as a hasty gift and a giver of counsel. And then he kind of goes into Levi is interpreted as taken up. And they actually go into great detail as to explain why the name change happened for the person based on his Hebrew name and his Greek name, because Matthew is not Hebrew. It goes back to a Greek origin, Levi, a Hebrew. So there's a lot there. So that I think what we've established from the beginning is that whether you're looking at some of the early patristics or even some of the myths and legends about the characters, there's some that say they're different. There's some that say they're the same, regardless of what era we kind of go into. So it seems like nobody ever settled the matter per se. Now, I think the majority of commentators in the early church would land them as the same. Maybe not in a massive majority, but the majority of the church fathers would certainly have posed them together in just how they did commentary on Matthew's gospel and the person.
Certainly by the 4th century, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But it didn't die after that point for sure. And some of these legends are the very reason as to why. So there's no doubt. So we have early attestation for confusion and early attestation for confidence, it seems like. So let's kind of like jump into origin.
I would almost contend actually the evidence of confusion is earlier. In no small part, I cannot actually find any 2nd century or even early 3rd century examples of conflating them. Even Irenaeus and others like that don't explicitly treat them as the same person. In fact.
Yeah, I would say Irenaeus just gets in the fact that Matthew issued a written gospel in the dialect of the Jews. Yeah,
and then he talks about a publican, but doesn't really name him.
Not by name, but he seems to. We're assuming his assumption here, so we have to be careful. Exactly. We're assuming his assumption because it's almost as he's assuming his writing is going to people who knew. But then again, we're assuming his assumption.
So we have to guess at what that was, which is why I just say explicitly. He just doesn't make any explicit connections. And then when we finally get to this discussion, one of our earliest is then going to actually be Origen. And
or the script of Matthew. Or the script of Matthew itself.
And the script of Matthew itself. Yeah. And that's partially why the problem exists in the first place.
Yeah, and it's interesting with Origen, as we talked about, and this is a good place to jump in on Origen. And I think there's we're hard on him, but we're also all training and learning, and we all change our minds over time too. So we
No,
have to be
exactly.
very patient with that. And his location change, which I think is a big deal, and maybe we can get into that. But he did state in the origin stated in the conception of his writing on Matthew's commentary that Matthew was a tax collector at one point. Then afterwards, he became a apostle of Jesus as the Messiah, and then he published to Jewish believers a gospel.
Right.
So what do you think the inconsistency formally lies on when it comes to Origen's perspective of this? Because he clearly states that in Matthew, and then in other places he starts, well, wait a minute, these are definitely not the same people. And then he gives a history, kind of an idea of who he thinks Levi is and Matthew is. What's your perspective of Origen's confusion?
I don't think that he was at least by the time, like when our writings are, we don't know precisely when these writings all date. We have to like guess as to which one was first, which one was later. So but with the writings we have, it just to me looks like he hasn't entirely made up his mind yet. And that he's still working through it because he's got a problem on hand. He like on the one hand, in Contra Celsum, he's very, very explicit that he doesn't think they're the same person, and he's specifically using that point as a rebuttal to Celsus, saying, no, actually, not all of his apostles were these, lowly figures of society. Only one of them was actually a publican. Levi wasn't among them, among the 12. And he uses that the authority he seems to be using are the synoptic lists of the Gospels, and the synoptic lists don't mention Levi, right, except for in the variant manuscripts, which he then is like, yeah, they don't mention this except for in like this one copy of Mark I have lying around, which is, and he's specifically pointing to that as an anomaly, not as the rule. So he's not putting stock in that specific manuscript there. He's very specifically noting it as an exception to try and and it's a very honest thing to do as well, because that doesn't help his point. It doesn't actually help his case that Levi was not among the 12, which is what he's specifically arguing against Celsus with. So when he notes that there's this manuscript that actually does say that Levi was Matthew, it's kind of an issue.
And we know he wasn't making that up, because we have manuscripts. Yeah, we have just to run by. Family 13 manuscripts contain the variant that seems to be in the mind of Origen, 565, and the biggest one of all is Bizet, which is always an odd one. But Codex D, yeah. So we know he didn't make that up.
No,
there was definitely a list.
This also means that he had multiple manuscripts of Mark at his disposal, because he was able to compare and contrast them, which is another interesting side point. But it's also not just Mark that actually makes these changes. So there are manuscripts then that have Thaddeus associated with Levi, specifically Matthew 10:3 in some variant manuscripts has Thaddeus called Leveos, and as Koch notes, that work the Levios is just a Latinization of the name Levi. When you basically when the letter V, the V sound, is very closely associated and often gets re-rendered as B quite often across languages. So we know this is definitely just the name Levi being used for Thaddeus, and it's not just that manuscript that does that. As I noted before, the Acts of Thaddeus makes that identification, and also the Apostolic Constitutions do as well on 2 occasions. All of which is extremely curious, because that's that creates multiple strands of manuscript tradition that have this weird confusion going on. And then you have the manuscripts variation in Mark 30:18, where it's James instead
James.
of Levi.
Yep.
All of it is extremely strange, which seems to indicate that the people who were receiving the manuscripts of the Gospels are themselves trying to figure out some way to harmonize this problem, and they're trying to figure out who is Levi, because if you only think of Levi as a separate individual figure in his own right, it's really weird that he only appears in this one place in the Gospel of Mark and never anywhere else. And then why is it so similar to the account in the Gospel of Matthew? The idea that, Matthew may have just be reworking a story and consolidating things to reduce the number of characters in the story and also give more prominence to the apostles doesn't really pop up for them. But that should also be a distinct possibility, that we have Matthew creatively reusing Mark and then inadvertently creating this problem down the line.
Yeah, and for me, the other side of that is that in lists of names, textual variants are very common.
Yes.
Even in Mark, you just mentioned, and those were the manuscripts that we were talking about when we talked about Bizet and Family 13 and 585 or 565. Those are all going back to the James one. So now you have James's name in there, not Levi, but James. And Origen recognized that variant, and that's the ones that we can say, well, we know he's not making these variants up. They were there. But we also have other ones. I mean, you go through Matthew's gospel, especially in the lineage section, you have confusion. It's like, okay, is this Asaph or Asa? When you get into some of the readings there in the very beginning, is it the king or is it the psalmist who calls himself Asaph in there? And there's others too, as far as Ammon, versus Amos. And so when you get into the lineage of Jesus, you actually, even in Matthew's gospel, start finding textual variances amongst the spellings and or name placements of where each name goes. So, I mean, it's easy if you're sitting there as a scribe and you have a whole list of something, it's easy to skip a line or to have a spelling reading or something that you just smudge and it carries on. But what's odd to me is that in the area of, it seems to be, and this is something where I think Origen comes into play here with where he is wrestling. He never wrestled with the tradition. And when he was giving his commentary of Matthew, he said, this is the tradition that's been handed down to us. Then he states that Matthew was the once tax collector. So the tradition that Matthew is, this is why I say we're assuming on Irenaeus a little bit by saying that we assume what he meant when he said the publican, he meant Matthew. But if Origen is right, we can kind of credibly assume that the churches were holding some sort of tradition about this because Origen said this is where he got it from. Where Origen seems to change places is in the discussion that we're having, the variants of the manuscripts. And when he left, because he was kicked out of the church in Alexandria, and he had to go down, and he ended up going down to Caesarea, and his friend ended up having being his bodyguard while he was there protecting him most of the time. And it didn't do him much good. He ended up getting arrested and all kinds of problems when he got there anyway. But he did his commentaries, a lot of his commentaries, once he got to Caesarea. And one of the theories that went around in the scholastic world in textual criticism for years was, is there a Caesarean text? And the reason that people got into the whole, is there a Caesarean text? Because when Origen went to Caesarea, the way he quoted the New Testament started containing unique variants that were not in any of the other manuscripts before, and including places where he was quoting same verses. Variants started happening from his time in Alexandria, it seems like, to his time in Caesarea. So is there this text type? That was a theory that passed around for a while. I would say that what he did is he seemed to have found variant readings in Caesarea that were different from what he had in previous places, which creates the problem of confusion for him. He knew the tradition. The tradition passed on through the church of Alexandria, which goes back, interestingly enough, to John Mark traditionally. So if John Mark did write the Gospel of Mark, which I believe he did, And then he went down into that area and started the churches in Alexandria. The tradition from the Markan tradition was always that Matthew was Levi. That seems to be the indication of what Origen is saying was traditionally passed to him. Then he goes to Caesarea, and all of a sudden his tradition isn't satisfactory, because now he's got manuscripts with James, he's got manuscripts with Levi, and the stories are in different names. Same stories with different names. So now he's having to be a textual critic, not a historian for the church. And so he seems to be working this out loud. And Origen did that a lot in his writings. Go ahead.
Yeah, which is interesting, though it would be strange that he would not then know, like, if he's arguing from the authority of of like a tradition that's being passed down from John Mark. It is interesting he would not specifically cite that, like when he's responding to this point, and he brings up this variant manuscript, and it's a variant manuscript that he does not believe. It's what he is noting as an exception. He would not very specifically say this is in violation of the tradition.
He does to Celsius, but then he goes back in his commentary of Romans, which is almost around the same time from our guesstimates. Like you said, we really, boy, it's really hard to date. It seems like Matthew is one of his first ones based on what Eusebius said about him. But he states in a comment about this variant in Mark 3:18, oddly enough, in his commentary of Romans, he takes the opposite view and actually states that they are the same. That Levi, who followed Jesus as tax collector, but he was by no means with the apostles. That's what he told Celsius. And then in his commentary of Romans, he says in one place he's called Matthew, and another place he's called Levi. Right. And it's like, okay, so
which causes also confusion with that timeline too. Like if he's dealing with, if this is a the post manuscript problem timeline, it's curious again that he's not specifically bringing up the authoritative tradition. He's instead just in the midst of this confusion and figuring it out and seeing it looks like he's trying to figure it out for himself. And it almost is like he doesn't have a whole lot of an authority to go on. So he has to try and balance manuscripts. He has to balance his own ideas. So he ends up with contradictory ideas depending on where we're at. Because he's working through it.
Yeah, I think part of his fight is that when he's writing against Celsius, he's having to give a defense. Right. Whereas in his commentating, his audience is not having to defend anything. He's maintaining that. See, this is where I think Origen was playing both sides of the field. And what I mean by that is he believed in an early tradition that was passed down possibly to John Mark, that they were always the same. Levi, Matthew were the same. But then when he gets into the textual critic, it's like he changes hats and he has to be a textual critic. And then he's receiving opposition. And it's almost as if he realized, and I do this too. I mean, as a Christian who defends the faith and defends the tradition of the church, I realize that sometimes my view is going to be an audience that's particularly the church, and I'm going to give my personal findings and just summarize it in a quick way to an audience that expects me to. But when I have to engage other discussions and get deeper into it, maybe even like this one right here, I'm not going, like my program didn't get into a lot of this. It's 45 minutes and it's particularly to a main group. So we're going deeper into this discussion, which I'm good with, and I'm glad we're doing it. But I'm going to take a different approach in this discussion and give a whole lot more latitude, and I'm going to have more dogma in my presentation to Christians. And perhaps, I'm not saying this is the case, perhaps when he's writing commentaries, he's maintaining consistency with the tradition of the churches. But as a textual critic who's having to actually defend something, that's not going to work for Celsius. He's going to have to go a little bit more technical than just saying, well, this is the tradition of the church, and that's what we've always held. Right. He's going to have to actually go into the legitimate details and say, this is reality. There is James, the son of Alphaeus, in these manuscripts I'm looking at right now.
Right. I think what is also interesting though is that like when it comes to the topic of, for example, um, the uh, the commentary, the commentary is also the place where he has the room to talk about what he wants and as much as he wants, and the issue and his findings as much as he wants, and he does this frequently. He goes on and talks about if I remember correctly, in some of his I think it's his commentary on Ezekiel, talking about how the god Tammuz is being worshipped as Adonis, and a bunch of other details like that. Details that aren't actually particularly pertinent. Um, he has room to tangent, and he always does have room to tangent when he wants to. So it's really curious that he doesn't do so here, which almost gives me the impression that this is either post or it has to be either post or prior to Contra Celsum, and at some point some changes have happened between them.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you would thoroughly expect him to bring up these issues if he was still undergoing the problems, especially when the way he talks about it in Contra Celsum, he's not dealing with an issue he's dealing with an issue where he's bringing up things that don't help his case. Like again, his very explicit case against Celsus is that they are not the same person, and that excuses Jesus of the accusation of being associated with lowlives as his apostles. He is very specifically using it to elevate the apostles in status and to remove the denigrative tendencies that you could see otherwise. So he doesn't want Levi to be an apostle there. And then he notes this manuscript that contradicts him, which says that he was one of them, one of the 12, which means that manuscript he had probably was actually saying that it was Thaddeus or James that was Levi.
Yeah, he kind of put an apologist hat on there for a minute.
Right. So he had to. So what's curious is that the positions are completely incompatible.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm not here to defend Origen's wish-washy. I'm trying to understand him. Like I'm putting myself in his position, and
I think it's the case that he's trying to figure it out himself, and he doesn't know because there's a lot of confusing stuff happening. Traditionally, it probably was that Matthew and Levi were the same because of the synoptic gospels commingling those. Matthew reutilizes the Levi story and puts Matthew's name in there instead. So it looks like, and traditionally, and up into the 4th century, the 4th and 5th century, that is what most Christians ended up believing. But you go and you look in other literature from the 3rd century and elsewhere, and you see that this was not at least a universally received tradition in Christianity.
Yeah, and that's where I kind of want to jump into is it seems like the disputes happen particularly down in the Egypt, Syria region. Some of for example, you mentioned Tatian's diatessaron, which is Syriac. Yeah. It's a Syriac. Then you talked about the Book of the Bee, where they were killed in 2 different places. Again, another Syriac tradition. And then we talk about some of the Gnostic works, the Matthew and the Levi being distinct.
But it, oh no, never mind. Sorry.
The Gnostic work, it was Coptic. It was a Coptic work. It's interesting that when we get into the Eastern churches, they don't seem to have this dispute. Whether you're talking about John Chrysostom, I've got his statement here. Chrysostom says, as we have cause also to admire the self-denial of the evangelist, being Matthew, how he disguises not his own former life, but adds to his name, when the others, being Mark and Luke, concealed him under another name. Theophylact, who is a commentator in the Byzantine region, again, the same eastern part of the churches, says, marvel at how the evangelist displays his own former way of life, while the other evangelist disguises his name, calling him Levi. And then we get to the time of Latin, and the translation into Latin. And we have Jerome, who makes 4 or 5, I think I counted 4 or 5 statements where he conflates them all together. It appears, and I did the best I could. You tell me if you found something different. I did the best I could to regionally see where disputes were. It seems like the Western churches did not have much dispute about this. Most of their writers were in agreement. They're the same. And then the Eastern churches, including commentaries from Chrysostom all the way to the 11th century with Theophilus, these guys are all saying the same thing. It is the same guy concealed under a different name. And they don't just say they're the same guy. They actually give a reason as to why Luke and Mark have a different reading there from Matthew. It's a name concealing. It's also a sense of humility and ownership of sin and repentance. They go through a whole list of detail. It seems like the place that had the variant is somewhere in the Egypt, between the Coptic and some of these Egyptian traditions where Origen spent his time in both. And then the Syriac tradition. Now, I don't know if you could think of some different regional places, but it seemed like the main issue is there.
I can figure out a few others. So, for example, Heracleon flourished in Italy.
Okay. Yep.
And then most of the many of the manuscripts we have were probably manufactured. Some of them are Western manufactured, but a lot of them are also in that Alexandrian type. The other issue is there are a few other texts as well, though, that are relevant to this, like the Acts of Thaddeus, which is composed in Latin and is also in that, and the Apostolic Constitutions.
Yeah, so there seems to be the Western side of things then, and we know those are later, and I get that. Like a lot of those are much later,
right?
But that's still a tradition that made its way at least to the West. If it wasn't in the earliest, it certainly made its way there and caused, again, question, confusion. Like, okay, well, all this time.
Yeah, the tradition with Heracleon, though, is actually 2nd century. Heracleon flourished, at least according to what information we have, in the late 2nd century, around 175.
I'm trying to think of the latest copy we have.
The latest copy of the manuscript would be from the Stromata, so fairly late, probably.
Yeah. And those are things, and I'm not against those things. It's just I wonder how much of that and where was he trained, influence and stuff, and then you have your copyists, and there's like, wow, there's a huge gap.
Yeah, how much of this has been altered over time, or is reflecting a change later on to conform it, or something like that.
Which we can't say yes or no on, so I don't even want to get into speculation on that. But seems like the Eastern churches, can you think of anybody in the East? So we have some Western later tradition and then a potential early one there, like you were saying. What about Eastern churches? Did you find anything in the Byzantium area or the Greek churches or anything like that?
Well, we have Ephraim of Syria.
Okay.
Who in his commentary on the Diatessaron identifies them as separate figures.
Right, which goes back to Tatian, the Book of the Bee, being Syriac.
So that goes back into the 2nd century.
Yeah, so that goes back to my point. It seems like Syria and Egypt had the most of the issues of this earlier.
But this is also the interesting point, though, because according to the tradition, John Mark set up the Alexandrian and Egyptian community.
Correct.
So that's the one place where we would not expect that variance.
Yes, and it seems like Mark's gospel has the most controversy around it when it comes to the textual tradition.
Yes.
And we don't, even today, we don't have very early manuscripts of Mark. I think the most recent one was out of Mark 1, a papyri that even Dan Wallace mistakenly in the middle of a debate gave a earlier date for. But even then, it's still the earlier of any of the ones that we had before it. Yeah. It's kind of like unbelievable, given its region was actually where most papyri is found. But I think that goes back to the fact that Mark's gospel was probably the least circulated of the four. Matthew is far more circulated.
And
go ahead.
I think if I remember correctly, that was also Michael Cook's point as well.
Yes.
So it's a very, very poorly circulated manuscript, and the early church fathers didn't really seem to care about it that much.
Yeah. John was very doctrinal. So John's gospel, once it was published, was very much circulated, especially in the Greek part of the world. And then even it made so quickly that we have even fragments of John, second century fragments into the early third century of John, very big sections, which were also attached to parts of Luke.
What is it?
P75 and P66.
P75, P66.
And then we have P50. Yeah. So then we even have the little small.
P52, the little credit card fragment.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, John circulated very, very well. Matthew spread probably faster than anybody. Pontianus, when he went to India, you mentioned India earlier and Matthew's travels there. When he reported when he came back to that area that they had already had the Gospel of Matthew before he got there and didn't realize that people had already brought the gospel message to that region before he even got there. Right. And it goes back to the tradition of Matthew being there. So Matthew's gospel was circulating very quickly and far away, I would say. And then, I mean, we even see it. Matthew is probably one of the most quoted from gospels. The Didache outnumbers Matthew 10-1 from the other synoptics, and doesn't even mention John's gospel. The early patristics were very much favorable to Jesus' sermons in Matthew over others, like the Sermon on the Mount. And a lot of what Mark has, Matthew has too, but they choose to quote Matthew's version of it.
I think the earliest quotation of Mark that we even have is Justin Martyr. And I think he only quotes it on like a handful of occasions. Specifically, I remember there's one reference where he speaks of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, as the thunderers or something like that, which is like only found in the Gospel of Mark.
I think
it's in the first apology, if I remember correctly.
He does mention. Are you talking about by name? Or by quotation?
By quotation, and he attributes it to the memoirs of Peter.
Yes, and I was trying to find my dissertation list I sent you because I'm pretty positive the Didache quotes Mark, and I'll try to pull that up in a second.
Yeah.
Which, if the Didache is first century, early second century, that'd be not far earlier than Justin Martyr, who you just mentioned. And I was trying to figure out if I'll have to pull it back up. I didn't have it ready.
Any of the apostolic fathers quote it, but in fairness, the apostolic fathers are inconsistent at quoting a lot of things. So,
well, sometimes they didn't cite where they were going. They just
too. It's like, okay, here's a quote from a synoptic gospel. Have fun.
Yeah, and a lot of times they paraphrased it. They paraphrased or summarized it too. And I'll look that up. I'm going to pull it up in a second because I didn't have that ready on there. Here's something to think about too. So my perspective of Matthew is different than a lot of people. I hold that Mark is the first Greek gospel, but I think there was actually a proto-Matthean gospel that was being circulated that the early church fathers, including Origen, talked about. There was a Hebrew Aramaic dialect kind of gospel going around. My personal position is that Matthew actually, in his time with Jesus, collected particularly just sayings, that it was more of a sayings and a sermons gospel, and that he corroborated that with Peter's eyewitness testimony through Mark. And I know we differ on these things, but just hear my view of Matthew. I think that Matthew had a collection, particularly of the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, some of the parables of Jesus, particularly out of Matthew 13, that were already collected. And then he corroborated that with Peter and some of the other disciples back in Jerusalem, because we have indication through some of the early writers that actually Matthew's gospel was translated. Some traditions even went to Barnabas, James, the Just, John. Not saying it's all of those or some of those or part of those, but what it seems to be from my study of Matthew, and I thought over this one for a long time, is that actually the church at Jerusalem saw it necessary to take whatever Matthew had originally circulated to them in their language, and to make it a gospel for the world, they had to bring it into the world language, and that was Koine Greek, or the trade language, Koine Greek. And I believe that Matthew's gospel And Irenaeus even says that it happened while Peter and Paul were starting churches in Rome, which would have been in the 60s. And so that's the case. Matthew's gospel came after Mark. Of course, I have an earlier date of the gospels. I have Mark early 50s, Luke late 50s, and Matthew in the early 60s. And that Matthew's Greek gospel.
Put Matthew after Luke.
I do. And I changed my view on that after a while, because I actually see where it seems in some places, and there's so much debate about this, it seems like there's in some places where Matthew is actually having to depend on Luke a little bit.
For context, I don't think Q is a thing. So
I don't either.
I'm on board with this, but reverse.
No, I don't think Q is real. Yeah. I think Q. I don't think we need Q. I think that the Proto-Matthean document is the missing Q that everybody wants to hypothesize about. I think that the one thing that was circulating in the churches was actually, in the Jewish churches, was actually the collected sermons of Jesus, the Lord's Prayer, the Sermon on the Mount, because those are the most unique, enchanted things. Even the Didache, which seems to be pointed at a Jewish audience, is particularly focused on Matthew's gospel and its instruction. And most of the time, the whole end is the Olivet Discourse, the prayer of Jesus teaching his disciples to pray, and Sermon on the Mount analogies. It's interesting because that was probably the main thing that circulated from Matthew's gospel very, very early on. And some people even believe that Didache was quoting a proto-Matthew, not so much Matthew itself. I would argue with that based on the citations being almost word for word in many places to the Greek text, but nonetheless, I don't differ from that. But I do think Matthew's gospel was a group in Jerusalem that used Matthew's collection, Mark's gospel, as well as maybe some of the Lucan material, and actually published a gospel that was meant to circulate further. Because if the headquarter church in Antioch and Jerusalem, those two main areas, was to send out something to the churches, it would go faster and quicker than any other account. Especially from Peter, if he had Mark done in Rome, and Luke, who is bringing a gospel together for Paul, it would make more sense that a more circulated gospel would find itself from the headquarters. And if Matthew's gospel was sent from Jerusalem and in Antioch, it would be the standard gospel in the late first, early second century. And that's exactly what we see happen. So that's kind of my theory. But with that, there's a translation there too, from one language to another. Could that also give rise to why the name Levi, which is a Hebrew name, changed to Matthew there in the Greek name, that the translators recognize, whether you think they're different or I think they're the same guy, chose to go with the Greek name in Matthew over Levi because they were translating one language to the other, and they went with his Greek name over his Hebrew name. Is that also possible, given that there's potentiality that Matthew's gospel went from one language and translated to another?
I don't think so. So there are two issues that I have with also the idea that Levi and Matthew are the same person, which is that so the name Matthew it comes from the root Metetyahu, and it's a Hebrew root. Levi is also a Hebrew name. While it is very common for us to find people with double names, it is almost always the case as a Hebrew and a Greek name, not two Hebrew names. In fact, as Koch notes, this would be almost entirely exceptional. So you can point to many examples of double names, even triple names in the case of Peter. But and there's the debate whether or not Peter is Cephas, and there is a little bit of confusion in the early church, not as much as here, but there's occasionally some pop up of it. But regardless, like in almost every other case, Paul, Saul. Paul is a Greek, Saul is Hebrew. This is the case almost always, or they end up with a title, James the Just, James the Great, something like that, or James the Righteous, or they end up being identified by their familial ties, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, or something like that. You don't end up with two people with Hebrew names like that. It's very, very strange and very exceptional, if it is a thing at all. And on top of that, on your hypothesis that this is Matthew, that is a translation element going into this. I don't think it's likely from the standpoint that it would necessitate that they translate the text twice instead of what they would have probably done, which is they would have translated it once, and then they would have copied that translation and disseminated that. You would not probably find a bunch of people who have decided we need to disseminate this text, and then decide let's all do it separate. Let's all translate it separately, because that would create so many different problems that even they would immediately know. Because not everyone's going to translate everything exactly. And if you are in a tradition that wants to have have a manuscript carefully passed down and be authoritative in any way, like transmitting the words of God, you don't want it to be open to such extensive changes. And if we're also positing that this is a time when Matthew may still be around as well, guiding this, or if this is or people closely following him, you'd also see that even more, that they would want a faithfulness to the text. So you would probably see it more like the story of how the Septuagint was translated, a committee translating it together as one text, and then disseminating copies of that translation.
Well, I think if Matthew is a part of it, I guess my point is with the translating of it, if Matthew is a part of it, which I think he would have been, and what John Chrysostom, Theophylact, others are saying is that this was his way of, I think, and even in the book you held up to our audience a minute ago, he suggests that one of the possibilities that has been posed is that it is an epithet. He doesn't personally believe that, but I seem to follow that in line too.
It'd be a very strange epithet.
Yeah, it is, but it isn't. It wouldn't be. The Greek Matthew has some, and by the way, Jerome actually talks about a Hebrew Matthew that is different, that he actually did a translation from, and that certain sects of people in his area were interested in the Hebrew Matthew. That he, by the way, it's interesting, he notes that Pamphilus the martyr had apparently copied and put in the library of Caesarea, and that there's a Hebrew Matthew that was in the library of Caesarea. Again, I just wonder what order
this is. And this is also one of the earliest traditions, going back to Papias. He's also of the opinion that there was a Logoi collection in the Aramaic language written by Matthew.
Yes. And Irenaeus said the same thing, that he posed one in his own
Irenaeus, in fairness, Irenaeus is also saying this on the authority of Papias. So
possibly.
Very probably, since he does explicitly talk about Papias in places.
But it was in a totally different book section.
It was, but it's especially also given the overlap in all their locations, these early church fathers, it seems fairly unlikely to me that it's coincidence.
Well, I don't want to take our time on this, but Irenaeus pushes back on Papias a few times and hardly gives him any recognition other than that he was traditionally a hearer of John and so forth. It seems like his biggest help and aid was back to Polycarp, not so much Papias. And
yeah,
it seems like that would have been more of his mentor and informant than Papias, because he rarely mentions Papias. He only quotes some weird things out of him and then just says, well, the tradition says he was a hearer of John, etc. He didn't seem to be very invested in the 5 volumes that he wrote. He just recognized them.
This is the other interesting thing, and I think, like, since we're getting close on closing, but it's an interesting point to also bring up is just that a confusion of apostles comes up again with regard to Papias, even
John the Elder, John the Apostle.
Exactly. Eusebius takes this as proof that there were 2 different Johns. Whereas traditionally it's supposed to be John the Elder, the one who actually followed Jesus. But then Eusebius is like, no, this was a different guy in Asia.
Different guy. Yep.
So it's again another one of those really interesting situations. It just consistently to me seems like that with the exceptions of a few apostles, and even then, like with the exceptions of like Peter and Paul and James, and maybe John, but even then, not completely. There isn't a consistently received tradition about their later lives or their writing.
Yep. And John was agreed upon, by the way. Jerome actually agreed that there were 2 tombs for John in Ephesus, and that he actually, and I actually agree with that. I think there were 2, by the way. I think there were 2. I don't think they were the same guy. I have friends that fight me all day on this. Jerome actually held that 2nd and 3rd John were written by the latter, by John the Elder, not John the Apostle.
Right.
And I tend to agree with, I think he was a part of the same group, but I don't think they're the same guy. And the fact that these people are saying there's 2 tombs with their names on them dedicated to these 2 different Johns, is like, okay, well, if there's 2 different bodies, I mean, wouldn't that mean there's 2 different Johns?
Pretty difficult to fight with that.
And it's not like John was an uncommon name. I mean, John the Baptist shows up on the scene in the John the Apostle. I think there were 2 different Johns personally. And then he mentions Aristion as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, it's a very confusing situation. And then you get into all the traditions about their later lives. Was Peter killed by Nero, or was he killed by Antipas? Who was Paul killed by? Where was he killed? Was he killed with Peter simultaneously or not, or were they killed separately?
Or
was Peter killed in Rome, or was Peter killed in Judea? All the traditions are consistently conflating or separating or various other things, and it seems to me that at least early on they don't have a solid idea of what was happening to the apostles, but there are several things that get passed down about them or about people with similar names that they are trying to sort through, and so you have confusion running amok because of that. Like, going back to our main topic, like if we were to suppose that John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark and he left a tradition about Levi and Matthew being the same person, it is astonishing that the place that he set up his church is also the place that breeds so much of this confusion.
Of the variants in the manuscripts. And it makes you wonder about the scribe work there as well.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, it comes down to, is the tradition, is it a tradition earlier than the manuscript errors? And
exactly,
I hold to the fact that Origen was wrestling with a manuscript issue, not wrestling with the tradition. He was pretty clear on what the tradition was. It was the manuscript tradition that was the problem, not the church tradition. And so I personally, and I know we differ here, I would personally say I think the church tradition is the correct one, and that the manuscripts just deviated from that, which created a problem for Origen, who tried to be both a historian for the church and also a textual critic. And his textual critic guy could not agree with his guy completely as a historian, and it created inconsistency in what he was finding in the way he argued. But nonetheless, there are differences of opinion, and thanks for sharing yours and elaborating so that the audience could hear both. And by the way, the Didache does not quote Mark from my dissertation data. It is First Clement that quotes Mark 10:27 in a very small fragment, which is similar to Luke 1:37, but I demonstrate that the wording is almost identical to Mark. So it's very possible First Clement quotes Mark, but the Didache did not. It actually goes Matthew and Luke only.
Yeah,
mostly Matthew.
Your dissertation data is also really, really awesome. I've actually used a little bit of it for my Philemon book.
I appreciate that.
Comparing Philemon and looking for quotations of Philemon, and then also comparing Philemon and First and Second Timothy as well.
And we agree on the data, but differ on the conclusions. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's another one we'll have to talk about.
Yeah,
I do have. I'm going to plug myself.
Go.
I do have a book coming out, hopefully in the next year, specifically on the topic of Philemon's authenticity. I'm arguing that I don't think we have enough information or enough data to really say that it was authentic, and there's enough variance in what we do have that creates a lot of problems. from the standard, the other 6 traditionally held Pauline epistles. And it has a number of ramifications, because if we can't consider Philemon authentic, the authenticity of other epistles, especially Colossians and therefore Ephesians, rests heavily on Philemon and the similarity between those two. So if we can't hold that Philemon's authentic, it follows that none of the rest do either on that.
Yeah. So kind of to give the audience some background on this, we corresponded about this, and I did, I built I don't remember if it was a chart. No, it wasn't a chart. It was just a line for line, verse for verse situation where words were actually the same. And I was trying to demonstrate that a personal letter is going to look different than a corporate letter. And I think that the comparison that scholarship is using at times to dismiss Pauline authorship is an unfair comparison when you're trying to compare Galatians to Philemon. Right. It's more applicable to do it to a personal letter, not a public letter.
Right.
And so some of the conclusions we were coming to is that the wording actually is very, very close. The conclusion I come to is, therefore, these are Pauline. Your conclusion is, therefore, Philemon is not Pauline, along with the other 3. We land on completely different, but our data is actually very, very close in our investigations. And I found that to be extremely interesting.
And what you end up finding, end up finding is that Philemon is closest to the Pauline letters in the introduction and the conclusion.
Correct.
The conclusion of Philemon is word for word identical to the a portion of Philippians, and only to Philippians. And it is also word for word the introduction is word for word identical across almost across several Pauline letters. Specifically, like send greetings to you by the grace of Jesus Christ sort of introduction. That's a very common one across what's traditionally held to be the authentic letters, and then also the inauthentic ones, supposedly the Deutero-Pauline ones.
Yeah, and that'd be a good discussion.
Yeah, and what's curious is also that introductions and outros are the easiest things for forgers to copy.
Yeah, we see that even in the later forgeries that they borrowed a lot of out of Paul himself. We have other letters like Paul to the Laodiceans, and
it is also of the traditionally accepted, scholarly accepted 7, is the only one to explicitly identify himself as a prisoner.
Yeah, and
but to me, but the inauthentic ones do that all the time.
Which I don't think they're inauthentic. And again, that's where we differ. But we go back and forth on this. But it's fun to look at the data and to investigate these things deeply, because we have so much to investigate of the New Testament that, and to me, this is a big thing for me as a Christian. We have so many places we can go to, from early church citations to the manuscript traditions themselves, and investigate so much of the New Testament that I really wish we had for some of the other, like we were talking about Papias's 5 volumes. We have nothing but fragments of those 5 volumes. There's a part of me that's like, man, I wish we had all 5 volumes. There's a lot of Origins commentaries that we talked about that we don't have. And it's hard to do comparative work, but we have a lot to do comparative work.
I would kill for his commentary on Philemon right now.
Yeah, who wouldn't? Maybe.
It's just so interesting. There's so much data that's missing, just or his side-by-side comparisons of different translations.
His hexaplet.
Yeah. And we only have like a few page fragments of it. That's it.
Yeah, and I love his writing back and forth that we have to Africanus and others about like even the Bell and the Dragon and stuff at the end of it. I read people look at me funny and they're like, well, what are you reading for your scriptural studying? It's like, well, actually at night I'm reading Origen's letter to Africanus on why he thought Susanna and Bell and the Dragon belonged in the book of Daniel. And they look at me like, what the heck are you talking about? It's like, well, that's what I do for fun. That's what I read. So
yeah, well, and it's a good thing to do as well, because I think this is a thing also for Protestants that they really ought to consider really recontemplating canon quite a lot more, because it's such an interesting topic, and it was not a universal thing in the early church at all.
Right. and those that know my program, I mean, no canon is a big deal to me. And
Yeah.
what I've not done is landed very differently from the so-called Protestant canon on most of my assertions. But boy, how I come to those conclusions are not what are taught in most of the conservative Protestant churches. Because I actually go backward in time and actually look at the controversies and don't ignore them. I recognize that it was even battled beyond the early church on some things, thanks to the Protestant Reformation.
I mean, we know. I mean, Martin Luther.
Yeah,
Martin Luther put James, Jude, Revelation, and Esther,
Hebrews,
and Hebrews in the Deuterocanon. And even before that, we know that other texts were still circulating as authoritative, like the targets of the Albigensian Crusade, the Cathars. And the Cathar Christians are a minority dualist Christian sect, and they had maintained a late first century text, the Ascension of Isaiah, as authoritative.
There were a lot of sectarian
even into the Middle Ages. It's and then you look at other canons like today the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains first Enoch. The Catholic Church maintains first, second Maccabees, first, second Esdras, Tobit, Judith, and a few others. So it's all extremely interesting, and it's like you can't make the case that canon is necessarily clear cut, especially when the largest Christian group in the world, the Roman Catholic Church, does not have the same canon as you.
All New Testament they do, just not
New Testament, yes,
just not the Old Testament.
But and then in the early church, what we now deem as New Testament was also in flux, like the Shepherd of Hermas, First Clement, Third Corinthians.
Yeah, we battle like on this program about how the Apocrypha came to rise and so forth, and the disputes there, and then because it's like, well, that's what later Rome believed. What about when Jerome was alive, still translating the Vulgate, because he on the Apocrypha quite a bit in many of his letters. But nonetheless, he still translated it because he had to shut up and do his job. But
yeah, exactly.
Well, at the end of the day, so we definitely differ on Matthew and the Levi thing, but we now see all the arguments and possibilities of these textual variants, and we're trying to reason through the rise of it. So,
and at least 4 different possibilities for who Levi is.
Yep. And then again, there's good discussion to be had here. And thanks for coming on and doing that. And maybe we'll do some more, like you said, on Philemon. There's a lot there too, but
definitely got to do some stuff on martyrdom too.
What's that?
Definitely have to do some stuff on early Christian.
Yeah. About the martyrdom and Nero's persecutions and stuff. That would be a good discussion as well. Well, thanks for joining. Appreciate it. Thanks for giving your feedback and giving us your thoughts and perspective in response to the video I did. Appreciate you doing that very much. All right. Thanks for everybody else joining in. Hopefully you learned something. We are very different. Everybody's different on perspective and thought. And my goal in this channel, as I've always told you for the years of those that follow me, I am not afraid of pushback, and I'm all about good, healthy discussion. And we have different worldviews. We have different biblical views. We have different historical views. And hopefully you're able to see that we're able to push each other back and even share the different positions. And nobody got killed, I don't think. So it's all good. And thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you learned some information about Matthew, Levi, and the textual variant. Maybe you learned something about Origen today or some of the early writers and their perspective on this. That's the goal of this program, is to teach you the early church, to teach you the differences, to teach you the battles that they went through. And I trust that you have been able to learn from today's program. Again, thanks for tuning in. Grace and peace to you.